Episode 67, Support Contracts, Intellectual Property, and Software Escrow, we bring together legal safety nets and the technical and operational realities they are meant to protect. For an exam, contracts are not just paperwork. They are the formal expression of how suppliers, developers, and service providers will protect cardholder data and keep services running. When those commitments are vague or disconnected from how systems actually work, the organization inherits hidden risk that only appears when something fails. When they are specific, testable, and aligned with technical architecture, contracts become powerful tools for continuity and accountability. The aim here is to think of legal language and engineering practice as two sides of the same protective system. A solid foundation begins with defining intellectual property or IP ownership, licenses, derivative rights, and confidentiality boundaries in clear, unambiguous terms. Contracts should state who owns the core code, customizations, configuration templates, and any derivative works produced during the engagement. License grants need to describe where and how software can be used, whether it can be modified, and under what conditions it can be shared within the enterprise or with auditors. Confidentiality sections must set boundaries around design documents, threat models, and operational procedures so that sensitive material is not reused or disclosed without permission. When these elements are defined precisely, future disputes about ownership and reuse are less likely to disrupt critical payment services. Data rights deserve their own focused treatment because they govern cardholder data, transaction records, logs, and related business information. Contracts should spell out the purposes for which data may be processed, limiting use to activities like transaction handling, fraud detection, support, or analytics that have been explicitly agreed. Retention limits must be clear, indicating how long different data categories will be kept and under what lawful basis, so that storage practices align with regulatory and internal policy expectations. Deletion obligations should specify how and when data is erased or irreversibly anonymized, including backups and derived data sets. When processing purposes, retention and deletion are described this precisely, the organization can align supplier behavior and privacy requirements more confidently. Security representations and warranties then convert broad assurances into measurable control requirements supported by evidence. A supplier might represent that encryption, access control, logging, and vulnerability management meet certain standards, but the contract should also require artifacts such as security policies, architecture diagrams, test reports, and audit summaries. Warranties can include commitments to maintain specific baselines, such as regular patching cadences, secure development lifecycle steps, or independent assessments. Importantly, these promises should be tied to the right to request verification materials at defined intervals or after significant changes. In this way, security language becomes enforceable and auditable rather than relying solely on trust. Notification timelines for security incidents, breaches, and material vulnerabilities are another critical centerpiece of contractual protection. Agreements need to specify how quickly the supplier will notify the organization when an incident affects shared systems, data, or controls, often using different timeframes for preliminary notice and detailed follow-up. Material vulnerabilities discovered in components used to support payment systems should also trigger timely alerts, even if exploitation has not yet occurred. Timelines must be realistic enough to allow accurate reporting, but strict enough to prevent long, silent gaps between detection and disclosure. When these expectations are clear, incident coordination can begin promptly, and the organization is better positioned to meet its own regulatory notification duties. For software that is truly critical to operations, especially in payment processing paths, escrow arrangements provide a last resort safety net. Contracts can require that source code, Build scripts, documentation, and necessary tools be deposited with a trusted escrow agent. Release triggers, such as supplier insolvency, sustained breach of support obligations, or failure to remediate severe vulnerabilities, should be defined with care so they can be invoked when necessary without endless argument. Verification procedures also matter, describing how the organization or a third party will confirm that escrowed materials can actually be built and deployed. These escrow terms ensure that critical capabilities do not vanish just because a supplier can no longer deliver. Escrow deposits are only valuable if they are current and complete, which is why periodic validation is part of responsible governance. Contracts can require scheduled confirmations that the latest version of the codebase, including dependencies, build instructions, and configuration templates, has been deposited. Build tests, performed either by the escrow agent or a designated third party, can verify that the materials produce working binaries in a controlled environment. Dependency inventories should accompany each deposit so that external libraries, frameworks, and tools are visible and can be obtained if needed. This ongoing validation transforms escrow from a symbolic comfort into a practical continuity option. Alongside code and data, trade secrets must be protected through carefully structured access controls, audit rights, and limited use clauses. Suppliers and customers often share sensitive know-how, such as fraud detection strategies, tuning parameters, or unique integration techniques that would be harmful if exposed or reused indiscriminately. Contracts should limit who can access such information, how it may be used, and under what conditions it can be shared with subcontractors or other third parties. Audit rights allow verification that these restrictions are respected in practice, not just in policy. By managing trade secrets this way, parties can collaborate deeply without losing control of their most sensitive intellectual assets. Indemnification terms address the financial consequences when things go wrong, particularly in areas like infringement, data loss, and regulatory penalties. A supplier may agree to indemnify the organization if their software infringes on third-party intellectual property, providing defense and covering judgments or settlements. Indemnity can also extend to breaches or data loss caused by the supplier's failure to meet agreed security standards, subject to negotiated caps and exclusions. In some cases, terms may explicitly cover fines or remediation costs arising from non-compliance with payment or data protection regulations. Thoughtful drafting here balances risk allocation so that parties bear responsibility in proportion to the control they exercise. Service level agreements, or SLA values, should align with recovery objectives, maintenance windows, and patch timelines, rather than standing alone as abstract metrics. Uptime commitments must be reconciled with the need to take systems offline for emergency fixes or planned security maintenance, so that continuity and patching do not work at cross purposes. Recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives should appear in contractual language where appropriate, especially for critical payment services. Patch timelines for high and critical vulnerabilities need to be explicit, connecting security expectations directly to operational practice. When SLA clauses reflect these realities, they guide behavior instead of creating conflicts between performance and protection. Termination assistance, transition support, and knowledge transfer deliverables are the contractual bridges between reliance and independence. When a relationship ends, planned or unplanned, the organization may need support to move data, reconfigure integrations, and train internal teams or new providers. Contracts should list specific tasks, such as exporting configurations, providing final documentation, and assisting with cutover plans, along with timeframes and compensation structures. Knowledge transfer sessions can address nuances in operations, monitoring, and incident handling that are not obvious from written materials alone. Explicitly capturing these deliverables reduces the risk of being stranded during transition periods when continuity is most fragile. None of this works in isolation, so legal, procurement, and engineering functions must coordinate to produce enforceable, testable contract provisions. Legal teams bring expertise in wording, liability, and regulatory obligations, ensuring that commitments are clear and enforceable. Procurement teams manage negotiation, supplier comparisons, and commercial structures, including how incentives and penalties are handled. Engineering, security, and operations teams contribute the technical realities that make clauses testable, describing how evidence will be collected and what constitutes acceptable performance. When these groups collaborate from the beginning, contracts become accurate reflections of the environment they are meant to govern. Before closing, it is useful to pause for a brief mental review of how these pieces fit together. Intellectual property clarity prevents confusion over who owns code, customizations, and confidential designs, while data rights define exactly how information can be processed, retained, and deleted. Security representations, warranties, escrow, and indemnities create a framework where obligations are both promised and backed by recourse when failures occur. Service levels and termination terms connect legal commitments to continuity, patching, and transition outcomes. Altogether, these elements form a contract landscape that supports assurance rather than merely describing it. Supporting contracts, intellectual property, and software escrow in this disciplined way turns legal language into a working part of your security and continuity architecture. For someone in a security role, it means being able to explain how agreements protect cardholder data, preserve operational resilience, and provide options when suppliers falter. A practical next step is to review one existing contract that underpins a critical payment service and check whether escrow verification, security evidence, and notification timelines are clearly defined. From there, adding or strengthening an escrow verification clause can anchor that safety net in practice, not just theory. As similar improvements roll out across agreements, contracts evolve into living safeguards that support both governance and day-to-day technical reality. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.